What happened the moment the giants took their last breath? Scripture says their bodies fell, but their spirits didn't rest. Enoch witnessed what came next, and it's a vision the modern church rarely speaks of. The earth had already swallowed the bodies of the giants when the real horror began. Genesis tells us plainly that there were giants in the earth in those days, Genesis 6:4, the offspring of the Watchers who abandoned their heavenly posts to take human wives. But what the book of Genesis leaves out, the book of Enoch fills in with a detail that should unsettle anyone who has ever wondered what happens to a soul born from disobedience. These were not ordinary deaths. The Nephilim did not simply pass into the ground like men. Their flesh perished, yes, but something else did not. Something continued. And according to Enoch, that something is still walking the earth right now, in a form we were never meant to understand. Enoch was no ordinary prophet. He is described in Genesis as a man who walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24, a phrase so strange that entire Jewish and early Christian traditions built themselves around trying to explain it. He did not die the way other men died, he was taken. And in the extra-canonical texts that bear his name, we learn part of the reason why. Enoch was shown things. He was carried through the heavens, past the boundaries where angels stand guard, into rooms where judgment is written before it is executed. Among everything he witnessed, one vision returns again and again, and it centers on the moment the giants fell. The book of Enoch describes the Nephilim as beings caught between two natures, neither fully angelic nor fully human, and this in-between status is exactly what made their deaths so unlike anything the world had seen before. When their enormous bodies collapsed under the weight of the flood and the wars that came before it, their spirits did not ascend the way a human soul might, and they did not simply cease as the Watchers who fathered them might have expected. Instead, Enoch records that evil spirits have proceeded from their flesh, and these spirits were given a name found nowhere else in Scripture with such clarity. They became known as demons, and the earth became their inheritance. Think about what that actually means. The disembodied, the homeless, spirits who once had bodies enormous enough to reshape the myths of every ancient civilization that remembered them, now wandering without form, without rest, and without the mercy of death. Enoch writes that they will corrupt, fall, be excited, and fall upon the earth and cause sorrow. Not for a season. Not until judgment arrives in some far-off symbolic sense. Enoch is describing an ongoing condition, one that stretches from the moment of the flood into the very world we occupy today. This is not folklore locked in the past. According to the text, it is a present reality with ancient origins. Notice too how carefully the text distinguishes these spirits from the Watchers themselves. The fathers were angels, bound in chains beneath the earth, awaiting a fixed day of reckoning described later in Enoch's account. The offspring were something else entirely, something the heavens apparently had no ready category for. They were not angels, so they could not simply be judged and imprisoned the way their fathers were. They were not fully human either, so death could not fully claim them the way it claims the rest of us. They occupied a gap in creation itself, and it is in that gap, Enoch suggests, that they have operated ever since, unseen but never absent, shaping temptation, division, and deception from a place outside the categories most of us were taught to expect. What makes this vision so terrifying is not simply that it exists, but where Enoch places it. It does not come at the beginning of his account, when the Watchers first descend on Mount Hermon and bind themselves by oath. It comes after. After Enoch has already recorded the corruption the Watchers taught mankind, the forbidden knowledge of weapons, of enchantments, of the movements of the sun and moon, meant to be used for control rather than wonder. It comes after the giants have grown so large and so violent that Enoch says they began consuming everything around them, turning first to animals, then to each other, and finally, chillingly, back toward humanity itself. Only after all of that destruction, only after the earth cried out under the weight of what these beings had become, do we reach the moment their bodies are destroyed. And it is precisely there, at what should have been the end of the horror, that Enoch's vision reveals it was only the beginning of a different kind. There is a reason the Apostle Jude, writing centuries later under the inspiration of the same tradition Enoch preserved, felt compelled to quote this book directly in his own epistle, describing angels who kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, and are reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. Jude 1:6. Jude was not inventing a new idea. He was drawing from a well already established in Jewish thought, one that Enoch had recorded generations earlier, one that early believers understood far more intimately than most modern congregations ever will. The Apostle Peter touches the same territory, speaking of the angels that sinned being cast down and delivered into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, 2 Peter 2:4. Two apostles writing independently, both anchoring their warnings in the same ancient memory of what happened when the sons of God crossed a line no creature was meant to cross. This is the world Enoch's vision opens into, not a world where evil was defeated at the flood and safely buried beneath the waters. A world where the defeat of the body became the release of something far harder to contain. And if that is true, if the spirits born from the giants did not vanish but scattered, the question becomes far more personal than historical. What did Enoch actually see happen next? What form did this vision take, and why has it been kept at the margins of Scripture for thousands of years? If verses like these move something in you, our channel exists for exactly this kind of exploration, the kind institutional teaching so often leaves untouched. Subscribing costs nothing, and it keeps this research reaching the people who are genuinely hungry for it. And if you want to go even deeper than any single video can take you, our companion guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, was built precisely for this moment. It walks through the Watchers, the giants, and the world before the flood, with illustrated detail that brings Enoch's visions to life in a way words alone cannot. You'll find it linked in the very first pinned comment below. What Enoch saw next did not come to him in a dream the way visions often came to other prophets. He describes being physically lifted, carried by whirlwinds past the clouds and the stars, into a realm where the normal rules of earth simply stopped applying. This is the part of his account that scholars call the Book of the Watchers, and it is here that the fate of the giant spirits is laid out with a level of geographic and physical detail that feels almost uncomfortably specific. Enoch does not simply say the spirits wander. He tells us where. He describes being taken to a place at the edges of the earth, a desolate and terrible region, and there he sees something that stops him mid-vision. Mountains of fire, and beyond them, a great chasm reaching down into darkness with no floor he can perceive. This is where the spirits of the giants are said to gather, not in some abstract spiritual plane, but in an actual location Enoch is shown with his own eyes, if a vision can be said to have eyes at all. He calls it a place prepared for those who curse, for those whose words rise up against the Most High. The imagery is deliberately physical, deliberately unsettling, because Enoch wants his readers to understand that judgment is not a metaphor in this cosmology. It is architecture. It is geography. Somewhere in whatever dimension these visions were shown from, there is a real chasm, and it is already occupied. Enoch does not rush past this scene either. He lingers on the details the way someone might linger on a memory too disturbing to fully release. He describes the trees on the surrounding mountains, the smell of the burning ground, the accompanying angel who walks beside him and explains what his eyes cannot fully interpret on their own. This guiding figure, identified in the text as Uriel, becomes something like a narrator threaded through the terror, translating cosmic geography into language a human mind can hold. Without Uriel, Enoch suggests, the vision would have simply overwhelmed him. Even a man who walked with God needed help understanding what walking that closely to judgment actually looked like. But it is not only the giant spirits that Enoch encounters here. He is shown the Watchers themselves, bound and suffering, and he becomes something unexpected in the story, an intercessor. The fallen angels, seeing that Enoch has been taken up and given access to the divine counsel they themselves have been barred from, beg him to carry a petition on their behalf. They want mercy. They want their case reopened. And in one of the most striking moments in all of extra-canonical scripture, Enoch agrees to plead for them, drafting a written petition and presenting it before God on their behalf, only to be sent back with a verdict that leaves no room for negotiation. There will be no peace for them, Enoch is told, neither forever nor for aye. The door that closed at their transgression does not reopen because a righteous man asks nicely. This detail matters more than it might seem at first. It tells us that even the most exalted human intermediary, someone who walked with God so closely that death itself skipped over him, cannot undo a judgment that heaven has already rendered. And if that is true for the Watchers, beings of far greater power and origin than their offspring, what hope is there for negotiating with the spirits their sin produced? Enoch's vision seems to answer that question by refusing to even raise it. There is no petition offered on behalf of the giant spirits. No appeal is drafted for the demons roaming the earth. Their condition is treated not as a temporary punishment awaiting review, but as the direct and permanent consequence of what they were. The prophet Daniel, centuries later, describes his own encounter with a heavenly messenger, who tells him plainly that spiritual conflict happens on a scale and in places most people never perceive, mentioning a prince of the kingdom of Persia who withstood an angel for 21 days, Daniel 10:13. Whatever else this passage means, it confirms something Enoch had already recorded generations before, that unseen beings operate with agency, with territory, and with an influence over nations and individuals that Scripture treats as entirely real rather than symbolic. Daniel's angel does not explain away the resistance he faced. He describes it as an actual battle, fought in a realm running parallel to our own, over a time frame measured in days, the way we would measure any earthly conflict. Enoch's vision gives us the origin story that passages like Daniel's only hint at. Before there could be princes of kingdoms opposing angels, before there could be spirits influencing nations from the shadows, there had to be a moment when disembodied beings first gained a foothold on the earth they were never meant to inherit. That moment, according to Enoch, is the death of the giants. Their bodies fall in battle, in flood, in the collapse of a world their fathers helped corrupt, and what walks away from that collapse is not defeated. It is simply changed. Freed from the limitations of flesh, these spirits become something more difficult to fight, not less, because you cannot drown a spirit, and you cannot bury what was never truly buried in the first place. There is a reason the ancient world remembered these beings under so many different names: oracles, demigods, restless ghosts of legendary warriors. Every culture surrounding the ancient Near East seems to carry some fragment of this same memory, a race of powerful hybrid beings whose deaths did not end their influence but transformed it. Enoch's account does not stand alone in claiming this. It stands at the center of a memory the whole ancient world seems to share, even when the details blur and shift from nation to nation. What Enoch offers that the surrounding cultures do not is a framework, a reason, and a warning wrapped inside a vision that very few people today have ever actually read from beginning to end. The Book of Jubilees, written in the same broad tradition, adds another layer worth sitting with here. It describes Noah himself pleading with God after the flood, distressed that the surviving spirits of the giants continue tormenting his descendants, deceiving them and leading them toward destruction. In response, Jubilees claims that only 1/10 of these spirits were permitted to remain active on the earth, the rest bound away for a time. If even a fraction of that number represents millions of years of confirmed influence, it starts to explain something that has always troubled careful readers of Scripture. Why does evil so often feel intelligent, coordinated, almost personal in the way it targets human weakness? Enoch's vision, paired with Jubilees, suggests an answer that institutional teaching rarely voices aloud. Once we accept that these spirits survived the destruction of their bodies, a harder question rises to the surface. What exactly were they capable of doing once they were freed from flesh entirely? Enoch does not leave this question unanswered, and the response he records is far more specific than most people expect. These spirits, according to the text, took up a kind of work suited to their new condition. They could no longer eat, sleep, or build the way they had before, so instead they turned toward influence itself. Enoch describes them as the source of false worship, leading humanity toward idols and toward violence, working in ways that mimic prophecy without carrying any of prophecy's truth. In other words, the deception did not stop when the bodies fell. It simply changed shape. This detail reframes a huge portion of ancient history that most people never think to connect back to Genesis 6. Every civilization that rose after the flood, Egypt, Babylon, Canaan, all of them developed religious systems built around powerful, capricious, often violent deities who demanded worship and sometimes demanded sacrifice. Scripture treats these gods with a very particular kind of contempt, not simply dismissing them as imaginary, but naming them as real, hostile spiritual forces operating behind the idols. Paul writes plainly that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. 1 Corinthians 10:20. A statement that only makes complete sense once you understand what Enoch had already described centuries earlier. The pagan pantheons were not empty inventions. They were, according to this tradition, the public faces given to spirits who had once worn the bodies of giants and now wore nothing but influence. It is worth pausing on just how consistent this pattern is across cultures that had little to no contact with one another. Mesopotamian religion speaks of the Anunnaki, powerful beings descended from the heavens who ruled over early humanity. Canaanite religion speaks of the Rephaim, a term Scripture itself uses interchangeably with the giants, in passages like Deuteronomy, describing them as a people of great stature whose memory lingered long after their kingdoms fell. Deuteronomy 2:11. Greek mythology speaks of demigods and titans locked away beneath the earth after cosmic rebellion. These are not identical stories, but they rhyme with a consistency that is difficult to explain as pure coincidence. Enoch's account offers the oldest and most detailed thread connecting them, suggesting that what later cultures mythologized as gods and titans, Scripture and its extra-canonical companions remembered with far more sober and troubling accuracy. Psalm 106 carries the same warning forward, describing Israel's own failures, when it says the people sacrificed their sons and their daughters unto devils. Psalm 106:37, language too specific to dismiss as poetic exaggeration. This was not distant mythology to the biblical authors. Here it was a present danger, one that required constant vigilance because the spirits behind these systems were understood to be actively seeking worship, actively seeking the kind of attention and devotion that once belonged to their fathers before the rebellion on Mount Hermon. Every altar built to a foreign god in this framework becomes a small victory for beings who lost their bodies but never lost their appetite for what they were denied from the beginning. Archaeology gives us a strange kind of confirmation here, not through direct proof of spirits, obviously, but through the sheer scale and strangeness of what ancient peoples built in devotion to forces they clearly believed were real and powerful. Consider Baalbek in modern Lebanon, where stones weighing well over 1,000 tons each were somehow quarried, moved, and set into place with a precision that still challenges engineers today. The site was later associated with Baal worship, a deity Scripture repeatedly condemns as false and dangerous, and the sheer physical impossibility of the construction has led generations of researchers to wonder what kind of belief or what kind of memory could motivate a civilization to attempt something so far beyond its apparent capabilities. Enoch's framework offers one answer that mainstream archaeology rarely entertains. Perhaps the memory of the giants and of the beings who once claimed to be gods never fully left the collective imagination of the people who lived closest to where the Watchers first descended. Göbekli Tepe tells a similar story from an even earlier layer of history, predating both the pyramids and Stonehenge by thousands of years, built by people who supposedly had no cities, no writing, and no complex social structure. Yet the site contains massive carved pillars arranged with clear intentionality, adorned with imagery of predatory animals and strange humanoid figures whose meaning remains genuinely unknown. Mainstream archaeology continues to debate what compelled hunter-gatherers to invest such staggering effort into a site with no obvious practical purpose, deliberately burying it beneath tons of earth not long after it was completed, almost as though it needed to be hidden rather than preserved. Enoch's account of Watchers descending onto Mount Hermon, teaching forbidden knowledge to early humanity, offers a framework that at least attempts to explain why a society without agriculture or writing might still organize itself around monumental, spiritually charged construction on a scale that shouldn't have been possible for people at that stage of development. This is what makes Enoch's vision so unsettling once you sit with it long enough. It is not simply a story about the past. It is a claim about the architecture of ongoing spiritual reality, one where the fall of the giants did not close a chapter, but opened a new and more difficult one. The bodies were destroyed because bodies can be destroyed. What survived them could not be drowned, could not be crushed, and according to Enoch has been working ever since to reproduce the same corruption that led to judgment in the first place, just without a physical form anyone can point to and confront directly. And this is precisely why Enoch's writings carried such weight among the earliest believers, even outside the boundaries of the eventual biblical canon. Early Christian communities read this material not as curiosity, but as explanation, a lens through which the persistent presence of false religion, idolatry, and spiritual deception across every generation of human history finally made coherent sense. If the spirits behind the ancient gods were real, if they had once been the offspring of angels who abandoned heaven, then every altar, every idol, every whispered oracle across the ancient world was not scattered nonsense. It was a pattern, traceable back to one moment, one fall, one vision Enoch was given the terrible privilege of witnessing. There is another layer to this vision that Enoch treats with even more caution than the fate of the spirits themselves, and it concerns the knowledge that came with the Watchers before their sons ever drew breath. Long before the giants grew powerful enough to terrorize the earth, their fathers had already begun corrupting humanity through instruction. Enoch names specific angels, Azazel chief among them, and credits him with teaching men to forge weapons of war, swords and shields, and the metallurgy needed to make killing efficient in a way it had never been before. Hazael is also blamed for teaching women the art of cosmetics and adornment used to seduce, and for revealing the secrets of precious stones and dyes, knowledge that on the surface sounds harmless, but that Enoch frames as part of a broader strategy to pull humanity's attention away from its creator, and toward vanity, violence, and self-sufficiency. This detail matters because it reframes the entire tragedy. The giants were not the origin point of the corruption, they were its consequence. Their fathers had already begun the work of unraveling creation's intended order, and the offspring simply amplified what had already been set in motion. Once you understand that the Watchers taught forbidden arts before they ever fathered children, the later violence of the Nephilim stops looking like an isolated event and starts looking like the natural outcome of knowledge given to a species that was never meant to wield it apart from divine guidance. Enoch's God responds to this specific transgression with unusual severity. He commands the angel Raphael to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness, covering him with rough and jagged rocks so that he may not see light until the day of judgment, when he will finally be cast into the fire. 1 Enoch 10:4-6. The punishment is not simply for lust or for rebellion in general. It is specifically tied to teaching, to the transmission of forbidden knowledge that humanity was not prepared to carry responsibly. This idea that certain knowledge itself can be spiritually dangerous when given outside its proper context runs directly counter to how most modern audiences think about progress and information. We tend to assume that more knowledge is always better, that understanding always leads toward improvement. Enoch's account challenges that assumption at its root. It suggests that some forms of understanding, whether about warfare, about manipulation, about the hidden movements of the cosmos, were never meant to be handed to humanity all at once, without the moral and spiritual maturity required to use them well. The result of premature access to that knowledge, according to Enoch, was not enlightenment. It was catastrophe on a scale that required the flood itself to correct. Other Watchers named in Enoch's account teach different pieces of this same forbidden puzzle, and together they paint a picture of an entire curriculum handed down before humanity was ready for any of it. One teaches the cutting of roots and the properties of plants, knowledge that could heal but could just as easily poison. Another teaches the observation of the stars for purposes of divination rather than wonder, turning the heavens into a tool for manipulation instead of praise. Another still is credited with teaching the signs of the earth and sun and moon, essentially handing over the beginnings of astrology as a means of control. None of these subjects are evil in themselves. What makes them dangerous, in Enoch's framework, is the timing and the intent behind their transmission. Knowledge given not to elevate humanity, but to bind it more tightly to beings who had already rejected their proper place in creation. Jasher, another extra-canonical text long treasured for the details it preserves outside the biblical canon, adds weight to this picture by describing just how far this corruption spread before judgment finally came. It describes violence, theft, and moral collapse becoming so normalized across the earth that the sons of men did not cease from committing wickedness, even as warnings multiplied around them. This is not a portrait of a world tempted occasionally by evil. It is a portrait of a civilization that had fully absorbed the forbidden teachings of the Watchers into its daily life, building its entire social order around exactly the kind of knowledge Enoch says was never meant to be shared so freely. The Genesis Apocryphon, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, offers something the canonical text of Genesis does not: a window into the emotional aftermath of these events from the perspective of the family living through them. It records Lamech, father of Noah, gripped by suspicion that his own newborn son might not be fully human, his features so unusual that Lamech turns to his father Methuselah in fear, who in turn seeks out Enoch himself for answers, traveling to the far reaches of the earth where Enoch dwelt among the angels to demand the truth about the child's origin. This detail humanizes the entire crisis in a way theological summaries rarely manage. Imagine living in a world so thoroughly saturated by the Watcher's corruption that a father could not be certain his own child was untouched by it. That is the atmosphere Enoch's generation occupied, and it is the atmosphere that makes his later vision of the giant's fate feel less like distant mythology and more like the direct, inherited consequence of choices made by beings who should have known better. What ties all of this together, the forbidden knowledge, the giants, the demons left wandering after their deaths, is a single consistent warning running through every version of the story preserved across these ancient texts. Corruption introduced at the top of creation's order does not stay contained. It spreads downward generation after generation until judgment becomes the only remaining option strong enough to interrupt it. Enoch was shown all of this, not simply as history, but as a pattern meant to be recognized, understood, and, if his writings are to be trusted, watched for again. And that is perhaps the most sobering thread running through this entire section of Enoch's vision. He does not present the story of the Watchers, the giants, and the corrupted knowledge as a closed episode with a tidy resolution. He presents it as a template, a warning built into the fabric of sacred memory, precisely because the conditions that produced it were never permanently eliminated, only interrupted by the flood. If forbidden knowledge could once corrupt an entire civilization until judgment became unavoidable, Enoch's account leaves open the uncomfortable possibility that the same pattern could quietly reassert itself, generation after generation, wherever humanity forgets the warning it was given. If Enoch's vision were simply a record of something that happened once and ended, it would still be remarkable. What makes it genuinely alarming is how deliberately Scripture ties this ancient pattern to events still ahead of us. Jesus himself, speaking to his disciples about the signs preceding his return, chose a comparison that would have meant far more to his original audience than it does to most readers today. He said, "As the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Matthew 24:37. This is not a passing metaphor about general wickedness. Given everything Enoch records about what actually characterized the days of Noah, the corruption taught by Watchers, the violence of giants, the saturation of forbidden knowledge across an entire civilization, Christ's warning takes on a far more specific and unsettling shape. He is not simply saying people will misbehave before his return. He is pointing directly at a pattern that Enoch had already described in detail centuries earlier, and telling his followers to watch for its return. This connection becomes even more pointed once you consider how the Apostle Paul describes the spiritual atmosphere of the end times in his letter to the Ephesians. He writes that believers wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Ephesians 6:12. Notice the layered structure here: principalities, powers, rulers, spiritual forces organized in what sounds almost like a hierarchy. This is not vague language about generic evil. It mirrors the very structure Enoch's tradition describes, a chain of corrupted authority running from fallen watchers down through the spirits of their offspring, all still operating in what Paul calls high places, a phrase that echoes ancient descriptions of spiritual influence over nations, thrones, and the unseen architecture behind human conflict. Daniel's prophecies add another dimension to this picture, describing a final kingdom marked by deception, so convincing that it draws its power directly from forces beyond ordinary human ambition. Daniel describes a ruler who will honor a God whom his fathers knew not, and prosper till the indignation be accomplished, Daniel 11:36-38, language that has led generations of careful readers to wonder whether the coming deception of the end times will not simply repeat the pattern first established by the Watchers, but will represent its final, most complete expression. If the giant spirits have spent millennia refining their influence through false religion, corrupted knowledge, and manipulation, Daniel's vision suggests that all of it may be building toward one final, coordinated deception rather than simply continuing indefinitely in the background. It is worth remembering, too, that Daniel himself was no stranger to the kind of visions Enoch experienced. He describes beasts rising from a churning sea, hybrid and monstrous in form, each representing kingdoms whose power was never purely human in origin, Daniel 7:2-7. The imagery is deliberately unsettling, deliberately hybrid, echoing the same unnatural blending that characterized the giants themselves, beings that were never meant to exist within the created order. Whether Daniel intended a direct connection to the Watchers' tradition or not, the resemblance is difficult to overlook once you have spent time in Enoch's account, and it suggests that this same pattern of unnatural hybridity and corrupted authority recurs at pivotal, unsettling moments throughout Scripture's prophetic history. Revelation confirms this trajectory with imagery that draws even more directly from the ancient chaos Enoch described. John writes of a great red dragon, identified explicitly as that old serpent called the devil and Satan, being cast down to earth along with a third of the stars of heaven, angelic beings who fall alongside him, Revelation 12:9. The parallel to Enoch's Watchers is difficult to ignore. Fallen stars, fallen angels, spirits cast down to earth where their influence continues among humanity. This is precisely the architecture Enoch described happening once already, now framed by John as happening again on a scale that will affect the entire world rather than a single region. Revelation goes further still, describing locust-like beings emerging from the bottomless pit with the faces of men and the power to torment humanity, Revelation 9:3-10. Imagery so strange and specific that many careful readers throughout history have connected it directly back to the spirits Enoch describes as originating from the giants, released now in a final and more devastating form. What should unsettle us most is not simply that these connections exist, but how consistently they appear across texts written by different authors, in different centuries, under vastly different circumstances, all converging on the same underlying claim. The corruption that began with the Watchers did not end at the flood. It was interrupted, contained, pushed back into the shadows, but never permanently eliminated. And according to the pattern Christ himself identified, connected explicitly to the days of Noah, that same corruption is expected to resurface, perhaps with greater intensity, as history moves toward its conclusion. This is why Enoch's ancient vision cannot simply be filed away as historical curiosity. If Jesus considered the days of Noah a meaningful template for understanding the last days, then understanding what actually happened in those days, understanding what Enoch actually witnessed regarding the giants and their spirits, becomes far more than an academic exercise. It becomes preparation. Consider, too, how the Sibylline oracles, though later and more complex in their origins, preserve a similar thread of expectation, describing cosmic upheaval and the return of ancient corrupted powers as history approaches its final turning point. Even outside the boundaries of what most traditions consider fully authoritative scripture, this expectation recurs again and again across the ancient world's spiritual memory, a consistent, layered warning that the pattern established in Genesis 6 was never meant to be understood as a closed chapter. It was meant to be recognized again whenever it began to resurface, by people paying close enough attention to notice. Taken together, these threads form something far more coherent than isolated proof texts stitched together for effect. They form a single unfolding story, beginning with watchers who abandoned their place, continuing through giants whose deaths released rather than silenced their influence, and pointing forward toward a final convergence Scripture describes but does not fully explain in isolation. Enoch stood at the beginning of this story, given a vision most of his contemporaries could never have understood. What remains is the question of what he saw at its center, the actual moment the giants fell and their spirits scattered, and why that moment mattered enough for heaven to show it to a single, walking with God-man thousands of years before any of us would need to understand it. Thank you for walking through this vision with us, all the way from the fall of the giants to the warnings still waiting to unfold. If Enoch's account has stirred something in you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next piece of this story, and take a moment to like this video and drop a comment telling us which part struck you hardest. For those ready to go deeper, our companion guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, is linked in the first pinned comment below, illustrated and built to bring the Watchers, the Giants, and the world before the flood to life in a way this video alone never could. More of these hidden scriptures are waiting on your screen right now, so stay close.